This is the GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 394, part 2, entitled Holding the Masculist Knife to the Throats of the Gender Politicians. Continuing straight on. Bullet. The Masculists claim that it is the gender politicians and the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts that are the indirect cause of young men's refusal to marry and rejection of paternity. Young men are now arguing to themselves that, quote, if I have a 1 in 4 chance of losing my kids, then why have them in the first place? A 1 in 4 chance is way too high. Fuck that, I'm not marrying, and to hell with being a father. Modern marriage sucks for men. End quote. Bullet. The gender politicians and society in general have not yet had their masculist consciousnesses sufficiently raised so that they do not see the writing on the wall. The masculist theorists are telling them that if the gender laws are not soon menfaired, particularly in the divorce courts and the para-legislated, then there will be a sex war. Bullet. The masculists are telling everyone that, open quotes in capital letters for emphasis, for strong emphasis, no culture that financially crucifies and destroys the lives of 1/4 of its fathers can remain intact. Men will explode, pick up arms and launch the sex war, assassinating first the gender politicians, then murdering thousands of fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges, and if the sex war really heats up, going out into the streets and shooting millions of fluffy feminists. All in capital letters. Bullet. The above is truly frightening for those readers who have never heard these ideas before. It is undeniable that 1/4 of fathers are being financially crucified in the fluffy feminist divorce courts. Things have to change, otherwise our populations will continue to crash. Bullet. In several countries now, the birth rate has fallen to under 1 child per woman, for example in South Korea. The growing rejection of paternity by young men who are being influenced by masculist and MGTOW ideas is the dominant but not the only reason for the population crash. Bullet. Millions of women prefer to keep their careers and don't want to have babies. For example, I have 3 nieces. 2 of them have chosen to be childless and are hotshots in their careers, outperforming the vast majority of men. But the dominant reason, given the numbers, for the crashing of the birth rate is the massive rejection of paternity by billions of young men, influenced by the ideas of the masculists and MGTOWs due to the awful toxicity of the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts. Bullet. If the gender laws are not soon menfaired, then the proportion of young men who reject marriage and paternity will probably be over 90% within a decade, so that whole populations will be wiping themselves out within a single generation. Bullet. It's only a question of a few years into the future before the gender politicians and politicians in general wake up to the awful population crash and become motivated to study the ideas of the masculists and MGTOWs who are directly causing this population crash. Bullet. The masculist theorists will tell these gender politicians that they have to menfair the gender laws before young men will be prepared to be fathers again. Otherwise, young men will continue to refuse to marry and continue to reject paternity due to the hated toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites. Bullet. The masculists will be telling the gender politicians that these politicians have to absorb masculist ideas so that they can socially engineer the gender expectations of young women so that young women learn to become FIPs or be severely punished by young men by being only pumped and dumped but never married and certainly not given young men's sperm. Bullet. The gender politicians will need to see that a fundamental restructuring of gender roles is necessary. The masculists are pushing for the para, which will force women to grow up, to take responsibility for their own lives, or be severely punished by young men who will utterly reject them, spitting at them for being fluffy parasitic vermin to be wiped out. Bullet. The gender politicians will need to become bi-conscious, that is, become aware as much of masculist ideas as feminist ideas, so that they do not remain feminazi bigots who see gender oppression as a one-way street. Bullet. Once the gender politicians have become bi-conscious, they will be in a much stronger position to systematically menfair the gender laws by pressuring young women to fib up or become manless, hence loveless, sexless, babyless, and increasingly spat at as masculinist ideas continue to spread throughout the culture. Bullet. The gender politicians will need to reform the divorce laws, legislate the para, implement positive discrimination in the primary schools by paying male primary school teachers higher salaries so that more men become primary school teachers, so that young boys can be given more male role models instead of the current figure of 90% of primary school teachers being female, and that many of them are real monoconscious feminazi bigots preaching to their young male students that men are rapists, men are toxic, men are morally inferior to women, etc. Bullet. The gender politicians need to be educated by the masculist theorists so that they do for men what they have been doing for women for the past half century. The current gender injustices for men are so massive that a sex war is brewing, but thanks to the monoconscious bigotry of the media, largely now controlled by monoconscious feminists, there is almost no penetration of masculist ideas into the mainstream media, so that the general public remains largely ignorant of masculist and MGTOW ideas. This must change, otherwise there will be a masculist explosion followed by a masculist soldier army-led sex war. Bullet. Over time, as masculist ideas spread, young men will be the first to be influenced by the masculist and MGTOW ideas on the internet. These young men will then learn of the toxicity of modern marriage, and this will increase the percentage of young men who refuse to marry and reject paternity. Bullet. These young men will tell young women that the main reason why they, that is the young men, are not giving their sperm to young women is that the divorce courts, taken over by the hated fluffy feminist monoconscious hypocrites, are way too toxic for men, so that these young childless women should hate the fluffy feminists as much as the young men do, who are being increasingly influenced by masculist and MGTOW ideas. Bullet. Masculist theorists are telling young women that they should put powerful moral pressure not only on the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites in the divorce courts, but also on the gender politicians who will be the first targets of the masculist soldiers in a sex war. Bullet. Thus, it is to be expected that not only will the masculists and MGTOWs have a hatred for the fluffy feminists, and especially for the gender politicians, in brackets, who made these deeply misandrous gender laws in the first place, thus financially crucifying and destroying the lives of millions of men over the past few decades, close brackets, but so too will the childless young women who have been taught by the masculist theorists that the primary reason why these young women are childless is due to the toxicity of marriage and paternity for men created by the fluffy feminists and especially by the gender politicians. Bullet. Thus, when the sex war boils over, we will probably see gender politicians being assassinated not only by vengeful, hateful masculists, but by bitterly angry and hateful childless young women who see the gender politicians as the main cause of their childlessness and hence their existential childless misery. Bullet. We will see young childless women claiming that they have assassinated monoconscious feminazi gender politicians at a similar frequency as have the masculists. Thus the masculists will see the hateful young childless women, will see the hateful young childless women as the enemy of their enemy and hence as allies. Bullet. It is this combined threat and hatred against the gender politicians, coming from both the masculists and childless young women, that is the masculist knife at the throats of the gender politicians. Bullet. In other words, if the gender politicians don't soon menfair the gender laws, particularly in the divorce courts and legislating the para, then both masculists and young childless women will be assassinating them in the sex war. They will slit the gender politicians' throats. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 390 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.